In Matthew chapter 15, there is a passage that speaks of the tradition of the elders. We can find it being mentioned in verses 1 and 2. Then the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem come to Jesus, saying, "Why are your disciples transgressing the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands whenever they eat bread." This is something that may be puzzling to us. Well, why is there a question about cleaning your hands before eating a meal? But if you notice, the scribes and Pharisees are speaking of the tradition of the elders. They're speaking of things that they hold, things that they follow. And these are teachings that Jesus and also the readers of this particular gospel would be fully aware of, since the audience for this gospel is primarily for the Jews. So there's not much detail about it here in these two verses. But if you go to Mark chapter 7, you will find that this same event is spoken of in greater detail, these traditions of the elders. If you look in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, we find the words, "And the Pharisees and some of the scribes were gathered together to see him, having come from Jerusalem. And having seen some of his disciples eating their bread with common, that is, unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, if they do not wash their hands, scrubbing with the fist, do not eat, holding fast the tradition of the elders. And when coming from the marketplace, they do not eat if they do not immerse themselves first. And there are many other things which they took to holding fast, like immersions of cups and pint pitchers and brass kettles and cots. Thereafter, the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why are your disciples not walking according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with unwashed hands?'" These texts, they speak of the tradition of the elders, but also they speak of the traditions of men. And again, we would wonder, well, where are they getting this stuff from? Why are they so concerned about washing one's hands before eating a meal? And they don't speak anything about germs and things like that. But instead they speak of things that are common, as in eating with common or unwashed hands. What I believe they are referring to are things concerning the oral tradition, the tradition of the writings of the rabbis found in the Talmud. And the Talmud is a work that is made up of 6 major divisions or orders. And one of these orders speaks of cleanness, which contains 12 tractates or books. The second to last tractate is one that focuses especially on the hands, and it is 4 chapters in length. And I thought it would be helpful for us to see some possible examples of the traditions of the elders, these traditions of men, to see how they dealt with things like what vessels do you use, how much water is necessary, when are your hands actually clean, and when do they remain unclean. If you look in this particular tractate and see these various texts, you'll find that they try to answer these questions, and they do so in great detail. If you look in the first chapter, in verse 2 of this particular work, it says, "Water may be poured over the hands out of any kind of vessel, even out of vessels made of animal or door, out of vessels made of stone, or out of vessels made of clay. Water may not be poured from the sides of broken vessels, or from the bottom of a ladle, or from the bung of a barrel. Nor may anyone pour water over the hands of his fellow out of his cupped hands, because one may not draw, nor sanctify, nor sprinkle the water of purification, nor pour water over the hands, except in a vessel, and only vessels closely covered with a lid protect their contents from uncleanness, and only vessels protect their contents from uncleanness from earthenware vessels." So this particular verse speaks about the different types of vessels one may use, the fact that the vessel cannot be broken, and the importance of having a lid over that vessel. If you look in verse 4 of this first chapter, we can find some further details. "If he cleansed vessels therein, or scrubbed measures therein, the water is invalid. If he rinsed therein vessels which had already been rinsed, or new vessels, it is valid. So there is the question of whether or not the water is valid or invalid. You can then go to the second chapter and look at verse 3. I find this one to be one of the most interesting and also one of the most detailed, because it explains what do you do whenever you are washing your hands and one hand is washed, but then the other hand, well, it's not washed. You stop halfway through. What do you do? Is your hand clean? Is it unclean? Are both hands clean? Are both hands unclean? This particular text tells us the answer, or tries to tell us the answer. It reads, hands become unclean and are made clean as far as the wrist. How so? If you poured the first water over the hands as far as the wrist, and poured the second water over the hands beyond the wrist, and the latter flowed back to the hands nevertheless become clean. If you poured the first and the second water over the hands beyond the wrist, and they flowed back to the hands remain unclean. If he poured the first water over one of his hands and then changed his mind, and poured the second water over both his hands, they remain unclean. If he poured the first water over both his hands and then changed his mind and poured the second water over one of his hands, his one hand becomes clean. If he poured water over one of his hands and rubbed it on the other hand, it remains unclean. If he rubbed it on his head or on the wall, it becomes clean. Water may be poured over the hands of 4 or 5 persons, each hand being by the side of the other, or being one above the other, provided that the hands are held loosely, so that the water flows between them. So again, that is extremely detailed. But one thing that was rather confusing is this particular text speaks of the first and second water. And whenever I first read that, I really didn't know what they were talking about, because I study the Bible, I don't study the Talmud. I simply found this information online and I am simply trying to share it with you. But if you look in the footnote number 8 of the first chapter, it explains what the first and second waters are. Water must be poured over the hands twice to ensure that they become absolutely clean. Maim explains that after water has been poured over the hands the first time, the water becomes unclean through the hands. Hence, a second cleansing is necessary. The first pouring is designated the first water, the second water. And there are many other things that could be said from this particular work. Again, it is 4 chapters in length, and it is focused on the hands. But I simply wanted to give you a taste of these different traditions, these different instructions that you could find in other Jewish writings. And that whenever you look at these things, it can help you to understand what are they thinking about? What are they focusing on whenever they speak of the tradition of the elders? And I hope this is something that has been helpful to you, and it helps explain it ever so briefly about where they're coming from. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video, and have a nice day.